Jeremy Corbyn.
Thanks, Bill. That was a beautiful introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me back to the West Belfast Festival. This is the third time I've been honoured by an invitation to attend, and Bill, it was a tough call. All I said was, which day? So thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for all that you've done and all that everyone else has done to develop the festival and all that goes with it. And I want to say a big thank you to Paul Maskey and John Funican for meeting me this morning in a fascinating discussion with young people, with colleagues and so on about the future of Ireland and about the social issues that face communities here. And it's wonderful to be in the hall with somebody who's become a very good friend over many, many years. Gerry Adams, thank you so much for being here this evening, Gerry. And Gerry has very kindly presented me with a couple of books. He's a fantastic writer, and I'm looking forward to the next instalment of your books about, how should I put it, determined and committed Republican people that have done so much to develop the movement all over Ireland. Now, this festival includes many things, particularly art, culture, poetry, and I am a very big believer in the use of culture and music to unlock the potential in so many people. So many people feel, young people, school isn't for them, college isn't for them, and they feel often very alienated. And so a political message is not just the dry facts of economic justice or world peace that we all seek. It's also about respecting the knowledge that so many people have and respecting the hope and the spirit that's there in people if you can only unlock it. As I've often said, there's a poet in all of us, but most are too afraid to admit it and write that poem and let it out. There's so much imagination in so many young people that's locked away when they feel inadequate and ignored. And so what's great is that this festival here in Belfast is discussing all of these cultural issues, language rights, language growth, and so much else. Whilst the debate in British politics is, how shall I put it, missing the point, I don't believe it that we're actually having a debate politically about whether or not we should end the two-child limit on social security benefits. Just think about it. We're actually saying we've got a two-child policy because we think the third, fourth, fifth child in a family is worth less than the first two. So we'll continue with this monstrous and cruel policy which penalises every large family, including here in Northern Ireland. It would cost 1.4 billion per year to end it and take 340,000 children immediately out of poverty. Yet the government is quite happy to announce 24 billion more on an arms budget, but says it hasn't got the money for the children. And so I make no apology for all the stuff that we put in the manifestos that we put forward in 2017 and 2019 about ending poverty, about redistribution of wealth and power within our society, and about challenging the gross economic inequalities that exist in our society. As Bernie Sanders has often said, America can afford anything. You know, he says it. America can afford anything. But it cannot afford inequality and the needs of its people. The same applies here to all of us. Let's make sure we get that message out. This event is about choices, the choices facing Ireland. And as somebody who is a very good friend of Ireland, there are many in my constituency that believe that I'm Irish, that believe I have Irish grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. Searches are going on to find them. And I'm sure, given enough time, we will succeed in that. Anyone in the room can help, I'd be most grateful. And so would my family. But it is about the future of Ireland and issues such as reunification, the language campaign, and about social justice and understanding of history. And in that, I want to quote, if I may, one of my huge political heroes, and that's James Connolly. The more I understand and the more I read about James Connolly, the more in admiration I am of him. Born in poverty, grew up in poverty, scant education, journeyed from Edinburgh to Dublin, to the USA, to Belfast, to Dublin, to Belfast, and then finally executed after the 1916 Rising. And what he said was in Erin's Hope, no Irish revolutionist worth his salt would refuse to lend a hand to the social democracy of England in an effort to uproot the social system of which the British Empire is the crown and apex. And in like manner, no English social democrat fails to recognise clearly that the crash which would betoken the fall of the ruling classes in Ireland would sound the tocsin for the revolt of the disinherited in England. Connolly was totally in solidarity with all campaigns and all movements in England, yes, in Scotland, in Ireland, but indeed all over the world. A true internationalist. Long before there was television, there was barely radio, there was certainly no such thing as mobile phones or the instant information that we have today. And he, in an article entitled The Economic Basis of Politics, he argued that an effective political force had to have its origins deep down in the daily life of the people, not in the brains of some half-dozen gentlemen in Parliament. He's very generous to gentlemen in Parliament, actually. And those words inspire us today and inspire us in so many other ways. Politics does not come from party leaders, does not come from elected representatives. If we're to achieve political change in our society, it can only come from the pressure of community organisation, of people demanding things together and bringing about that reality of social justice and holding to account those that they put forward and elected in order to bring about those changes. He was a very proud trade unionist and supported struggles here and abroad. His heroism in the dock strike, but his support for other strikes in England and the way he was prepared to travel all over Britain and the USA in order to achieve that. And I think it's wonderful that my good friend Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, also quotes James Connolly as his hero and talks about James Connolly on the picket lines in Britain. He paid the ultimate price. He paid the ultimate price and was executed in 1916 in the most brutal and horrible way possible, designed to humiliate him. But even in the moment of death, he was writing what would be his last epitaphs to people and smuggled it out under the bedclothes to Noreen to give to the rest of the world. And you just think for a moment, had Connolly not been executed, had the others not been executed, they would have been freed in a couple of years because the politics had moved on so fast. How different Ireland would be, how different the world would be, but for the lives that were stolen from us in the executions of those that led the Easter Rising in 1916. So the question is, how can we replace that vision today? How can we replace that vision and how do we go forward? Because history is the most fascinating and controversial subject one can ever get involved in or discuss. But when you are discussing history, you have to learn the lessons from it in order that we can go forward and not necessarily make the same mistakes in the future. And so this year is the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. It was an historic achievement. And I pay tribute to all of those that helped to bring that about. Crucially, the spark that set it off is sitting here. It's Gerry Adams, the Hume Adams Accord that started it off in the very beginning. A brave and very important thing to do. But that process didn't happen one day in 1997. It happened many, many years before with the vision of a united Ireland, but the determination to achieve a peace process. It was a peace process that doesn't recognise the history of all communities, the motive force in the culture of all communities is not likely to achieve very much. And I want to say a big thank you to those who went into government with Sinn Féin, Martin McGuinness and many others, who did so much to encourage the peace process in Colombia when it was seen to be utterly hopeless. And now Colombia has a progressive government in Petro and the vice president. It has a leadership that is determined to bring about what they call a total peace in Colombia and a ceasefire of all of the factions. And there's good news coming out of Colombia. What happened in Ireland, the determination of people to achieve a just peace in Ireland, has had ripples around the world. And I look forward to going back to Colombia. I was there for the election and I've been there before on a delegation to support them and work with them. And I see that in part and parcel as the work that has been done by so many people here in Ireland to help bring that about. I voted for the Good Friday Agreement when it came to the House of Commons in 1998. And I was thinking, I think it was the first time I'd ever voted with a government on anything to do with Ireland in all the time I'd been in Parliament. So it was, to me, it was an aberration. And then I think back of all the other stuff that's gone through Parliament in relation to Ireland and the statements that have been made and the abuse that was there. The way in which the British Parliament responded to the hunger, the famine in the midst of the 19th century, blamed it all on the farmers, when in reality Ireland was being forced to export food to England, whilst the working class, and particularly the rural working class in Ireland, was starving to death. Anyone who doubts my words, go to Skibbereen and look at the museum there and see the horrors of what that did. And so that history lesson ought to tell us something about attitudes towards Ireland. Look at the way the Home Rule Bills were scuppered. Look at the way division was created. Look at the attitude towards the tram strike and the dock strikes in Ireland and the Dublin lockout. Look at what happened in 1916. And then later on, in the 60s and early 70s, what did we have? But the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the broadcasting ban, the travel ban, and so much else. They knew it was never going to work. And I kind of wondered at the way Gerry Adams' voice had suddenly transformed from being somebody in West Belfast to being this beautifully modulated Oxford English accent. I don't know, I thought Gerry had had an operation or something. I wasn't quite sure what had gone on. And so it all became impossible, and eventually we had the peace process. But a week before that vote, I was given a copy of the 1799 secret British government report on the situation in Ireland. The report reproduced the entire statement of the founding conference of the Society of United Irishmen. The United Irishmen and their sister organisation, Society of United Irish Women, set out a vision of uniting Catholic, Protestant and dissenters in equal measure in a new Ireland. A vision that's still not fully realised, that I concede. But looking around Belfast today, looking at the statements that Connolly made and the history that he put to us, there is hope and there is a determination that we bring about a true unity of people all across Ireland. And I want to see that united Ireland, I hope, in my own lifetime. And as you can see, I'm very young, so I'm prepared to wait for a long time. But the recent elections have shown that the unionist majority in the north no longer applies. Absolutely historic. It no longer applies. The 1922 partition was designed to fasten a permanent unionist majority in the north, and there is now a non-unionist majority in the north. And as one who sits on the backbench of the House of Commons behind where the DUP sit, I hear stuff. I've got very good ears. And I can be very quiet when I want to. It's very interesting. Very, very interesting. I recommend it. Very, very interesting. And the attitude towards figures in Ireland amongst those in all parties, including the Labour Party, has changed so much. And I think we should pay tribute to those people in Britain who in the 1970s and 1980s, despite all the political and media attacks that were made upon them, were prepared to speak out for Ireland, were prepared to speak out for peace with justice in Ireland, and were prepared to keep up that dialogue with Republicans in Ireland, particularly my friend Ken Livingstone, who did so much to help achieve that through that time. And Jerry will remember this very well. In 1996, he'd written a book and he wanted it published, and I offered to host the book launch in the House of Commons, and it was a big to-do. Everybody got on my case and said I shouldn't be doing it, and I said, why not, and so on and so on and so on. I was threatened with all kinds of awful things, and hellfire and brimstone would land upon my head, all because I was offering to help give a voice to somebody who was a very, very important figure in the Republican movement in Ireland. And so just think, things have moved on a great deal from the days when it was seen to be unbelievably brave to march from Kilburn to central London in memory of those that were killed in Derry to the current situation. That didn't come about by accident. It came about by the determined work of lots of groups, politically in the unions, in the Labour Party, and in lots of different community groups to bring about that different narrative and that different understanding. But we have a problem at the moment, the DUP boycott, because they could now, today, this moment, announce that they will participate in the Assembly, to get the Assembly up and running again. They could do that. And those elected at the last elections would then take up their office. They are putting a boycott on it. They think they're pressurising the British government. I'm not sure the British government particularly cares what they think or what they say. I care what they think and what they say, because I want to see that devolved assembly up and running, because the people in Belfast, in Derry, all over Northern Ireland, face exactly the same problems as the working class in England, Wales and Scotland. The benefit system that impoverishes people, the lack of proper regulation of the private rented sector, which causes so many to spend so much of their money on rents, and the levels of poverty, shortage of housing, and so much else that is the lot of so many people within our societies. And we need a government there that can actually act and speak up for those people and start making those demands on the Westminster government to bring about an end to the poverty and injustice that so many people face in this area and in other places. And so I think we have to recognise that working class unity, trade union unity, is very, very important in order to keep that pressure up. If we're to move into a period of economic consensus amongst the major parties in Westminster, then that economic consensus doesn't apply on the council estates, it doesn't apply on the picket lines, it doesn't apply at those queuing up at food banks trying to survive. We need an economic alternative that ends the poverty and injustice that so many working class communities are facing because of this obsession with following neoliberal economics in order to keep the redistribution of wealth moving entirely in the wrong direction. Now that then moves on to the question of the future of Ireland and the discussions about the potential for a border poll, the potential for the reunification of Ireland. If you study the history of the period, particularly the very intense period from 1900 to 1922, you'll see the systematic way in which the policies were developed in order to bring about the partition of Ireland. And that partition cost the lives of so many and has cost so much ever since that time. And I want to say is that before we move on to the question of a border poll, that is some time away, there has to be that community discussion. There has to be that debate amongst people about how we bring it about. There has to be that debate about how you ensure that people don't become frightened by the process, that they understand that this is a process that they have a right to take part in and a right to make the final decision. What the Good Friday Agreement actually says, and I quote, "It is for the people of the island of Ireland alone, by agreement between the two parts respectively and without external impediment, to exercise their right of self-determination on the basis of consent, freely and concurrently given, north and south, to bring about a united Ireland, if that is their wish." That's what it says. That right can be exercised, and it is a democratic process that would help to bring about peacefully a big change in the historical fortunes of the island of Ireland. The behaviour of the British government over Brexit and the trade arrangements, I think, have changed the debate enormously, and I think we're moving into a position where a border poll becomes not just a possibility, it becomes much more of a certainty. Not straight away, not next year, maybe not the year after, but at some point in the foreseeable future, it becomes something that is a good discussion to have. And there has to be a discussion on the obligations and responsibilities, jurisdiction of transfer of operations, and the question of citizenship, and the 1949 agreement on the free movement of people between Britain and Ireland, which I believe should be maintained and respected. And so it is important that we do all of that. The Labour Party in the 1970s and 1980s often refused to discuss Ireland at all. Labour Party conference for year after year absolutely just refused to discuss Ireland in any way. There were obviously fringe meetings and the like, and I attended and spoke at very many of them. There was this refusal and a belief that somehow or other the military actions in the north would bring about some kind of military solution. If you talk to anyone, even those in the British Army at the time, they'd say, it's not going to happen, it's impossible. There has to be some different way of doing things. So much life was lost, so much blood was spilt, so much hardship happened because of refusal to engage in the obvious need to deal with an historical wrong about the way that people were being treated in Ireland and the way that that partition was brought about. My old friend Tony Benn was fond of saying this about Ireland, and he was also a great friend of Ireland. He said, ultimately, there isn't an Irish problem in British politics. There's a British problem in Irish politics. And so that's a message that I'll be taking back from this wonderful visit I'm undertaking at the present time. But it is, as I started the speech, also a question of hope, hope for the future. Bobby Sands suffered and died. Bobby Sands made the ultimate sacrifice for what he believed in and so many others. And I cannot ever forget the wonderful thing he said was, our revenge will be the laughter of our children. What a fantastic message that was from Bobby Sands. We now have a younger generation in Ireland that is not so committed to religious structures as older people were, and perhaps some still are, that is more united, that is more hopeful, that is more free-spirited, and has been a huge change away from the social conservatism that marked Ireland for a very long time. And those young people need a future of hope, not a future of poverty and debt, not a future of being told they're second-class citizens and don't matter. They need something that brings about some real hope for them, and those decisions should be made here in Ireland. And that's why I hope that the discussions about the concept of a border poll make a lot of progress. Because the supporters of the Good Friday Agreement and of self-determination need to ensure that that vibrant discussion does take place, as indeed it's taking place here at the West Belfast Festival. This is a long-term peace process. It's not going to happen straight away. We need a long time to do it. We need that celebration of Irish history, of Irish culture, of Irish sport, debate and discussions that go with it. And this festival, which started from relatively small beginnings, is something that is making a huge difference. And it's also, as Bill was saying, about solidarity, international solidarity. And I think it's fascinating and noteworthy that people and communities that are totally under stress here and anywhere around the world immediately see the point and need for international solidarity. They don't see it as some sort of luxurious add-on that you just throw in at the end of a meeting to feel good. They see it as something practical and necessary. Hence the solidarity with the people of Palestine under occupation and suffering essentially from an apartheid system that's been imposed upon them on the West Bank. And so I think we have to express that solidarity, but also the solidarity of those in other conflicts around the world. I want to see an end to the war in Ukraine. I want to see the peaceful future for the people of Ukraine and of Russia. And if the European Union and NATO are unable to bring about some kind of peace process or peace dialogue, then I applaud the work that's been done by President Lula in Brazil, by President Petro in Colombia, by López Obrador in Mexico, and the Organization of African Unity in order to try and bring about a ceasefire to end the carnage. It's got to be a time when we recognize that the southern sections of this planet, in Latin America, in South Asia and Africa, have a role to play. It hasn't got to be the private concern of just the wealthy and militarily powerful nations of the North. So thank you, African Union and Latin America, for trying to bring about peace there. And think also of the wars that are going on, other wars that are going on. The occupation of West Papua by Indonesia. Western arms being supplied to Indonesia to maintain the subjugation of the people of West Papua. Why? There's a lot of minerals there, basically. The war that's going on in Yemen, fueled by massive arms sales, and the desperate plight of so many people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Child labour being used to extract coltan in order to fuel all of or facilitate all of our mobile phones around the world. And the way in which the people of the Congo have been treated, it's reminiscent of what Roger Casement wrote in 1909 in his report about the conditions of people in the Congo when the mineral companies were putting the people into slavery in order to extract minerals from the Congo. It's exactly the same now. Where are our international media reporting any of those conflicts, any of that exploitation, any of that slavery? No, they're bowing down before the interests of global capital to get cheap minerals at the expense of the poorest people on this planet. We are the internationalists in wanting justice for people in all countries of the world, in all situations where they're facing that exploitation. And I want to say thank you to the Irish community, particularly in my own constituency, and all that they've contributed to our lives. We had a celebration recently to commemorate my first 40 years in the UK Parliament. Ready for more? And it was very nice that, and very grateful to her for Michelle Gildenew for coming along to represent and to present me with a massive bottle of whiskey. I don't actually drink whiskey, but it's all right. I know plenty of people who do. And also for her work when Sinn Féin first decided to take up having people in Westminster and when she was first elected. So it's wonderful that she's here today, along with other colleagues today who've done so much to help bring about that voice in British Parliament. So to Paul and to John, thanks so much for today, and to Michelle, thank you very much for coming along to that. But in our community, the Irish people who came over to London and to Birmingham, so many other places, they worked very hard. They lived in desperate poverty. They suffered racism and discrimination. Remember the signs, no blacks, no Irish in here. And the trauma that many of those single Irish building workers working on building sites and lump labour in terrible conditions built the motorways, built the railways, built the canals and so much else that's there in Britain. And some of those suffered terribly in children's homes before they came over and have gone through those kind of trauma. So there has to be a reckoning of justice for them. So in our own way, we've at least tried to bring about some kind of physical commemoration and recognition of those. And so in Archway, in my constituency, the Archway Tavern, the centre of all good things, we've put up a lovely mural there commemorating the work of the Irish community. And we've renamed the area Navigator Square in honour of the navvies for all that they did in Britain. We also have a plaque nearby commemorating Roger Casement, who was executed at Pentonville Prison, and the huge contribution that he made. And down the road we have the site, because it's now being demolished, of Her Majesty's Prison Holloway, where one of the inmates there made history. Constance Markievicz was first elected to the British Parliament in 1918 for Dublin Central, and her address was HMP Holloway, Islington, London. And so she didn't take up a seat, obviously, but she was the first ever woman elected. And like the people before her, she was a victim of the prison system, as was Sylvia Pankhurst and others. And so to show our sense of history and the Cat and Mouse Act, under which the suffragettes were put in prison, they went on hunger strike, they were allowed out when they're in such a bad condition. When their condition improved, they were taken back into prison to continue their sentence. It was called the Cat and Mouse Act. So in order that this isn't forgotten, we've just built a new library in my community and called it the Cat and Mouse Library. And we also recently unveiled a plaque to Michael Collins outside the Barnsbury Hall, where he was initiated into the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1909, because I think that the contribution of all of those who did so much to try and bring about the end of British rule in Ireland, to bring about independence, they were victims of the oppression and exploitation by landlords and others in Ireland to continue keeping so many Irish people in poverty, forcing them into emigration to America, to Australia, to New Zealand, to Canada, to Britain, and so many other places, that we should think of it within its historical concept. And so the history of Ireland is one, I believe, of human oppression of so many people. And I would like to see Irish history much better taught in our schools than it is at the present time. And so from the Good Friday Agreement, we've made enormous strides. The political, social and economic developments that have happened in recent years in Ireland have changed things dramatically and absolutely massively. But there are times when you have to take a decision on that fork in the road in history. And so I think the discussions that are now going on the future of a united Ireland have never been more important and more relevant. And Connolly once wrote of an Ireland where the mere mention of its name would at all times serve as a beacon light to the oppressed of every land. That indeed, I think, is a dream worth pursuing. And this festival does so much to open up the minds, open up the understanding of people, and help to bring about a more just and peaceful world in the future. Our minds are often imprisoned by the way in which the media form our opinions. Our aspirations, collective aspirations, are often lowered by the discrimination against working class people, racist discrimination, and so much else that happens in our world. It is only the strength of community organisation and political organisation that can change things. And Ireland has produced more poets and musicians per head of the population than any other country in the world that I can think of. There's fantastic works of literature, imagination and poetry that have dominated so much in Ireland. But I want to finish with a poem, if I may, but it won't be an Irish poet, because I want to read to you one verse of a poem that was written by a great Nigerian poet, Wole Soyinka, about Nelson Mandela. When Nelson Mandela was should have been at the depths of despair in prison. He was there in Robben Island. He was sentenced to decades and decades of imprisonment for standing up against apartheid, for standing up for the people that he represented. And he was being brutally treated, as were all the others on Robben Island. And the poem is entitled, "Your Logic Frightens Me, Mandela." And the verse I'll read is this one. "Your logic frightens me, Mandela. Your logic humbles me. Do you tame geckos? Do grasshoppers break your silence? Bats, radar pips pinpoint your statuesque gaze transcending distances at will? Do moths break wing against a light bulb's fitful glow?" Mandela, alone in that horrible prison on Robben Island, relied on the solidarity of people around the world and, of course, more importantly, the people of South Africa to end that ghastly system and bring about a different South Africa and make his contribution to a different world. It's the bravery of those that suffered, abused, tortured, and imprisoned that have helped to bring about, hopefully, the peace, the freedom, the cultural diversity, and the hope that our generations shall enjoy. Let's not close our minds to the future, but open our minds to the future of the kind of world that we can all live in. That is what the real human spirit is really about. Thank you very much.